Finally, we come to the political effects of World War One, and they are vast and they are numerous. Probably the most impactful for this class going forward is the Russian Revolution, which is caused by World War One. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the Russian Revolution. We're not going to get into all of the intricacies, but I highly recommend, if you haven't read it already, because I'm not sure if it's even on the school reading list anymore, I recommend you read Animal Farm by George Orwell. Orwell is personally one of my favorite authors. I highly recommend you read 1984, not only because it'll give you an excellent understanding of what totalitarian and fascist governments are like, which we'll talk about in a couple of episodes, but it's just a really excellent novel. But if you want to get an idea of how the Russian Revolution is viewed by Westerners from the outside, I recommend you read Animal Farm by Orwell. It is I don't know the literary term, but essentially it's a a symbolistic telling of the Russian Revolution involving farm animals. It's a really, really awesome read. I can't recommend it enough. You should read all the George Orwell you can get your hands on. Anyway, my opinion aside, let's talk about the Russian Revolution. So, thanks to the highly oppressive and highly absolute monarchy in Russia over the past 400 years or so, um, Russia is a society that is very, I don't want to say backwards, but very static. There's not a lot of upward mobility for the peasant class. In fact, they weren't freed from feudal obligations until the 1860s. So you have a very small landowning class with a ton of power in Russia and a very large peasant class with almost no power. And World War One really kind of accelerates the problems that Russia had been facing over the past 400 or 500 years. The majority of the soldiers who fight in World War One for Russia come from the peasant class, and they die in large numbers. Russia does take the most losses of any of the countries that fight in World War One. So those continual losses, as well as the absolute monarchy, as well as resentment in the Russian population over the government's mishandling of industrial programs, leads to what we call the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Now, the Bolsheviks are not the first to revolt against the Russian government. There is what's known as the March Revolution, where the Tsar and the royal family are relieved of power and a kind of democratic republic, sort of not quite government, takes power, essentially like a transitional government. And that government makes the mistake of trying to continue to fight in World War One, and it lasts only a few months. And then in October of 1917, Vladimir Lenin, as well as his followers in the Russian Communist Party, overthrow the transitional government and begin the process of setting up a socialist government in Russia. Now, the Bolsheviks, because of their staunch communism and socialist ideas, see the monarchy as the way that the people of the French Revolution did, as a symbol of the old way of life, and therefore they move very quickly to have the Tsar and his entire family executed, basically bringing an end to the old regime and the old way of life in Russia. With the Tsar out of the way, Lenin takes over in the capital of Moscow. And one of his first moves is to negotiate the Russian surrender and remove Russia from World War One in 1917. Now, this would potentially have a massive effect because this would free the Germans up to fight only a one front war, with the exception of the fact that it's kind of counterbalanced by the United States joining the war at roughly the same time. More importantly, though, in Russia, this begins a very long and very bloody revolution for control over Russia. Now, Lenin and the communists control the capital of Moscow. However, if you look at any map, Russia is enormous. And the communists are not completely supported by the peasant class. A lot of people do not see socialism as workable for Russia, and therefore they would like to bring back the Tsar and the royal family on a more limited basis, kind of like a constitutional monarchy like Britain. So, what happens over the next 4 years is that you have the Reds, i.e., the communists, fighting for control of the country versus the Whites. And the Whites are kind of a coalition of anti-communists. These are people who support the monarchy, known as czarists, as well as people who support other forms of government, some democratic republic, some constitutional monarchy, who kind of just see themselves as Russian nationalists, and that they feel like communism is trying to erase what makes Russia Russian. They're trying to erase the cultural Russian aspect of the country. So this civil war lasts from 1918 to 1914. The whites are actually supported by many of the Allied powers. Japan, Great Britain, the United States all send supplies, and in some cases, medics and troops to support the whites. But this civil war eventually is won by the communists. So by 1924, the Bolsheviks have pretty much consolidated the majority of the country under socialist control. And they create a Russian communist state known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is going to have an incredible amount of influence on the rest of the 20th century. They also set about trying to inspire more socialist revolutions all around Europe to create governments that are friendly to the Soviet Union. Now, in 1923, though, this communist revolution takes a very, very, very important turn. In 1923, Lenin dies. And I mean, I don't know if there's anything else that you can compare it to. Maybe the death of Muhammad, maybe, but those two things are very, very separate. Um, Basically, what this creates is a huge power vacuum. Lenin was viewed very idyllically within Russian socialism. I mean, he was kind of the founder of Russian socialism. He was an early student of Marx, and this creates a massive hole in the government. And there is a huge power struggle between all of the top deputies to Lenin. The two main contenders that emerge are Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Now, Trotsky is more moderate. He believes he is a socialist, but he's more of a democratic socialist, meaning that the government does not need to have full control of all of the means of industry. That private business can work alongside socialism. Stalin, on the other hand, is much more extreme. He's much more hardcore communist. And eventually, Stalin, because of his ruthlessness, which we will talk about later in this class, is able to shove Trotsky out. And he has him exiled from the USSR. And then he also has him murdered in exile in Mexico City in, I believe, 1928. And under Stalin, with his main rival out of the way, Stalin goes about the process of creating a very centralized, very dictatorial Soviet Union, which is going to kind of set Russia in this collision course with democratic capitalism and the United States later on in the 20th century. Now, politically, the other main thing that comes out of World War I is known as the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles is the peace treaty that brings an end to World War I. And the process of negotiating this peace treaty, of rearranging the world after what is the most destructive event in human history up to this point, is dominated by what's known as the Big Three. The United States, because of its economic dominance around the world, Great Britain, and France, because they're the remaining original members of the Triple Entente. Now, this means a lot of things. This means A, those three groups, the Americans, the British, and the French, are going to get whatever they want for the most part. And it means that their other allies, specifically two nations in particular, Japan and Italy, are not going to get what they want out of this peace treaty. And it creates a lot of resentment among the people of Japan and Italy that they are treated as lesser members of this alliance, even though Japan fought on the side of the Allied powers since the very beginning. Italy was, involved in the war long before the United States. But their treatment and their basically dismissal by the Big Three is going to come back to haunt everyone in the build up to World War II. Now, the other big thing that comes out of this is the humiliation of Germany. Again, if you think back to what we said about the alliance system, most of this tension in Western Europe begins with the unification of Germany. Germany is seen as the ultimate threat to Britain and France's dominance in Western Europe, which they've essentially held for the past almost millennia. And so the British and the French set out to completely not only humiliate the Germans, but to basically destroy Germany as a world power for the foreseeable future. And the list of punishments that are laid at the German feet are long. They're forced to pay war reparations. Essentially, they are given a war debt that they have to pay back to the British and the French, that in modern day terms would be somewhere around $300 trillion. There is also what's known as the war guilt clause, where the Germans are forced to acknowledge that they and only they are the solely responsible for the start of World War One, that no one else but Germany can be blamed politically and formally for the start of the World War One. Their empire is dismantled. All of their colonies are stripped from them and split up amongst the British, the French, and the Japanese. There are massive limits put on the size and the scope of their military. Germany is not allowed to have any sort of air force. They're not allowed to have any sort of navy other than like a coast guard for protecting their ports. Their army is limited to 100,000 men, which may sound like a lot, but when you consider that Germany sent over 10 million men to fight in World War One, it's pretty insignificant. Unfortunately, what the French and the British don't consider is that the anger and the national embarrassment to the German people is again going to come back and haunt them, because in the late 20s and 30s, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party are going to use the Treaty of Versailles, and they're going to use that anger and resentment of the German people to swing themselves into power and carry everyone else into World War II. Now, you also see after World War One the creation of the first global peacekeeping organization known as the League of Nations. This was a personal pet project of the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. And the goal here was to create an organization that would prevent wars like World War One from happening, that all of the major states of the world would willingly join this League of Nations, and they would work cooperatively in order to stop things from reaching the point that they did in World War One. Unfortunately, it never works. The League of Nations ends up being one of the great jokes of world history, um, because it's voluntary. And so, whenever the goal of the League of Nations come into conflict with the goals of one of these other great powers, the great power just simply pulls themselves out of the League of Nations the way that the Japanese did in the 1930s and the way that Germany does in the 1930s. And essentially, the League of Nations is helpless to stop them unless they want to go to war. Elsewhere, the Ottoman and the Austrian empires are dissolved, and for the most part, the territory of these two empires is used to create new states. The idea of national self determination becomes a huge goal of the Versailles Peace Conference. Many people feel like World War One would never have happened if the Austro Hungarian Empire would simply have given the Serbians what they wanted, which was the right to rule themselves. If they had given them independence, if they would have given them the ability to rule and make laws for themselves, then much of this would have been avoidable, right? So a lot of the ethnic minorities, a lot of these little independent cultural groups, these nations in the losing empires are given this right to self-determination. The Allies redraw the map of Europe and of the Middle East in order to give a lot of these ethnic minorities the chance to rule themselves. And you see bunches of new states pop up all over Eastern Europe and the Middle East. However, interestingly enough, and but not surprisingly, um, one place where this self-determination process is somewhat ignored is in the colonies of Africa and Asia. Many of these people fought for the great powers during World War One, and they are screaming for many of the same things that these ethnic minorities in Eastern Europe and the Middle East are screaming for, but yet they are denied to them because a lot of these Western powers still see themselves as relying on the colonies for materials, for manpower, and for labor. So that is going to start brewing a powder keg that is going to explode in the near future, especially after World War II, right? So here you can see the map of Eastern Europe before and after 1914. As you can see, the German Empire as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire is for the most part broken apart, creating numerous different nation states, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Romanians, and the Slavic peoples are all given their own individual nation states and given the opportunity to, to rule themselves for the first time for many of them in hundreds and hundreds of years. A lot of the same thing happens in the Middle East with the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. The Persians are given their own individual state of Iran. The Arabian Peninsula becomes an independent state of Saudi Arabia. The remains of the Ottomans are founded into the Republic of Turkey. However, some areas of the Middle East, Syria, Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, and Palestine, do not gain their independence. They do not gain their own nation state. They instead become what's known as mandates. And this begins a long and very complicated process in the Middle East, one that is still being fought over today. Generally, the reason for this is the same reason that colonies in Africa and Asia are not given their own independent rule. And that's mainly because they have resources that Western European states want. And in those specific areas, the resource is oil.